Hello to my German readers. I am so happy that The Woman in Cabin 10 has been such a success. I'm looking forward to the publication of my next novel, The Lying Game, and I hope you like it just as much. Well, The Lying Game is about four women who went to boarding school together on the south coast of England. When my editor originally wrote the blurb for the book, she described it as an exclusive boarding school, but I said, no, it's very important, it's a second-rate boarding school. So they went to boarding school together and they were expelled for reasons you don't immediately find out. But 17 years later, the one remaining girl who still lives down there sends the other three a text saying just, I need you. And they drop everything in their lives. My main character, Isa, picks up her newborn baby and they hot-foot it down to Salton, the village where they went to school, to find something that has resurfaced from their past and which spells disaster for all of them. Well, it's a very good question. In a weird kind of way, The Lying Game sort of loops back to my first book, In a Dark, Dark Wood. So when In a Dark, Dark Wood came out, one of the first reviews said that it did for female friendship what Gone Girl did for marriage. Now, obviously, if you've read Gone Girl, you'll know it centres on a pretty toxic marital dynamic. So on the one hand, it was a massive compliment. I love the quote. I'm a huge fan of Gillian Flynn. So I was really thrilled by the comparison. But on the other, I immediately felt incredibly guilty about all of my amazing female friends who've got me through some really tough times in my life. You know, they've really been there for me. So my second book, The Woman in Cabin 10, was about something completely different. It was murder on a cruise ship, and it was just not the right time to go back to that material. But when I came to write my third book, The Lying Game, I thought, right, this is a chance for me to set the record straight, to tell people how amazing female friendship is, how supportive women are to each other, how women would walk through fire for their best friends. So that was the premise of the book, but obviously I'm a crime writer, so the reality was a little bit different and quite a lot darker. I find it really hard to pin down the kind of cultural inspirations for a book. For me, things that are much more obvious are the places that inspired it, or the kind of the dynamics in my own life that I can see I'm sort of thinking through. But in terms of, specifically in terms of books and films, I guess the biggest influence on The Lying Game is probably things like I Know What You Did Last Summer and those kind of teen horror movies, which I love. I'm a massive kind of fan of that genre. But it always seems to me that the terrible thing that emerges from the past in those films, it usually comes back to bite the protagonists quite quickly. And I was interested in exploring what might happen when someone's past came back to haunt them, but much later on, when they've got a family, a career, a whole kind of edifice of deception resting on this thing that they did, when basically they've got a hell of a lot more to lose. So that was the kind of the kicking off point for The Lying Game, was someone who's done something in their past that is about to come back to haunt them, but it's from a really, really long time ago when they've got a lot to lose. I find this question so hard to answer. I think one reason is that when I'm watching films and TV shows, I don't tend to look at who the people are unless they're like, you know, mega famous, like Nicole Kidman, I think is recognisable wherever she's in. So I'm really bad at fantasy casting, full stop. But the other problem I always have is that to me, these characters are so real. It's a bit like being asked who would play your dad. And, you know, the answer is, well, my dad is my dad. My dad is Harrison Ford or Sean Connery. So basically the answer is, I don't know. But I love actresses who can pull off that kind of dynamic that hovers between strength and vulnerability. So people like Rooney Mara, Kristen Ritter, you know, those people who can play a character that's simultaneously incredibly strong, but also visibly flawed. Set setting in my book is always so important. I love to travel somewhere where I've never been, and often the setting kind of comes first and is in a way as much of a character as the actual, people in the book. The Lying Game is no exception. So the setting actually was one of the first pieces of the puzzle that I kind of put together. So I guess it must have been about 4 or 5 years ago, we were on holiday in northern France, and we went to this place called Saint-Suliac, which is often described as one of the most beautiful villages in France. And it is incredibly beautiful, but it's also very spooky and very atmospheric. So it's this old stone fishing village, and because it's a fishing village, they decorate it with fishing nets. So they're strung between the houses and they're kind of looped across the facades, and they hang over the windows and the doors, a bit like, if you've ever seen, those films set in the deep south in America, like the kind of swags of Spanish moss that you see hanging there, all these giant cobwebs. And they're a real fishing net, so often you would see used buoys or, bits of dead crab still sticking in them. And I found it incredibly spooky and atmospheric. And one morning we were driving out of the town, probably to get croissant at a boulangerie or something, and we were driving over this salt marsh estuary, I guess, and we saw up against the horizon this tide mill, and it was black and crumbly, and you could see, no one had clearly inhabited it for years. It was, there were birds flying in and out of it, and you could see daylight through the roof tiles, but it was incredibly beautiful. And as soon as I saw it, I thought, I have to put this place in a book, it's got to go in a book. But it took me 4 or 5 years to find the right setting, and that setting was the Lying Game, and the tide mill turned into the house where Kate lives. But I'm a very British writer, all my books are set in the UK, and I knew that I didn't want the setting to be France. I wanted it to be an English boarding school. Clearly that wasn't going to be on the north coast of France. So I picked up the whole of Salton along with the tide mill and plonked it down on the south coast of England. And it's never really specified in the book, but the area that was the inspiration was Romney Marsh. I honestly don't know is the answer. I guess part of it is I'm naturally a very kind of guilt-prone person. I'm one of those people that wakes up in the middle of the night and starts thinking about, all the things I might have said wrong during the day, all the people I might have offended, or, that thing I did when I was 10 years old and, wasn't as nice as I could have been to that girl in my class. That sort of thing still haunts me. So I suppose part of it is as kind of cheap psychotherapy for myself in a way. But female friendship, I guess, partly, it was a desire to show a different kind of friendship to the one I depicted in Would. But partly it's probably just that my friends are and have been such an enormous source of strength and joy and frustration over my own life. And so I want to explore those kind of tensions in a book.